Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about the brain and the cranial nerves that go along with this portion of the chapter. So we've talked about the neural tissue, we talked about the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord. Now we talk about the central nervous system, separate from the spinal cord. We talk mainly about the brain. There's a lot about the brain. We only really talk about the surface of it because some of it is unknown and some of it is just too deep to really go into with this course. There are entire courses that are dedicated to neuroscience, neurobiology, and really studying just the brain. So for us to talk about this in a week or 2 week time span, we're just really touching the surface. So something to know about is that the brain, the human brain is it's about 3 pounds, somewhere between 750 and 2100 milliliters. And the thing about the human brain, people always think about, oh, why don't we get bigger brains, bigger brains, bigger brains? For our size, the brain is very, very large. So compared to other organisms, our brain is massive. And what we really consider when we talk about how big our brain is the energy consumption. So when people say, why don't our brains continue to get larger and larger and larger? Well, it gets to a point where is it worth it to have that much larger of a brain? Is being that much smarter, being able to have that much better of a memory or, as any more intelligent, is that going to help us for survival? So it goes back to survival of the fittest and ultimately our brain growing is a part of evolution. So we've really come to a peak where if we made our brains any larger, the energy consumption would be way too high. So uh, energy consumption, typically you hear about people say that the brain consumes somewhere between 25 to 35%. I've heard up until 45 or 40% of our energy, the calories that we take in. So as much as you think it must take for us to move around and stay active and do all those things throughout the day, the brain is really constantly using a lot of calories, using a lot of energy. It takes a lot to keep it going. Keep in mind that brain really never gets a true rest. It does kind of wind down when you sleep, but that's a chance for the brain to kind of make sense and dial back a little bit of everything that's been taken in. And when you sleep, you're going to kind of keep what you need and leave behind what you don't, because you can't hold on to all of the information that we ever saw or learned, because it would just be far too much. So uh, that brain is always working and it's constantly consuming energy. So when we talk about the brain, the big one that we always talk about, or people always think about, when you say that word brain, you're thinking of the cerebrum. That's that superior portion of the brain that we think of when we see the brain. But the brain also consists of these portions here, which are very important, because without these, we would not be able to survive at all. If you have some issues with the cerebrum, then you might be able to survive depending on it. But really, if you have any issues with these other parts, I mean, really specifically, we talk about the cerebellum being a major component, as well as the medulla oblongata. So these are the 6 regions of the brain that we talk about. But when you think of brain, you're just really thinking of this top part, this cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, controls higher mental function. So in humans, we see that the cerebrum is very large compared to other organisms. When you do a dissection in school, typically your teacher is going to order a sheep brain, and you see that the sheep brain, the cerebrum of the sheep brain, is not very large compared to when we look at models of the human cerebrum. The cerebrum is divided into left and right hemispheres. Surface layer is gray matter, which we call the neural cortex. So the surface area with that's made up of gray matter, we're going to call the neural cortex. Also sometimes called cerebral cortex, and it's folded surface increases surface area, and this increase in surface area is really going to help to make the most of that brain. All right, so we think of the brain being a certain size, but depending on the folds really influences how well that brain functions. So men tend to have larger brains than women, but women tend to have more folds. So they're taking advantage of that increased surface space in order to have the same intelligence as men and women. So don't ever think that men and women don't have the same intelligence because men have larger brains. It really comes down to surface area, and women keep right up with that. So we have elevated ridges, which you can call a gyrus, or they're called gyri, and you have shallow depressions, which is called a sulcus or sulci, and then you have deep grooves, which are called fissures. Cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, coordinates repetitive body movements. So when we talk about repetitive or repeat body movements, that is going to be the cerebellum, and it's covered with the cerebellar cortex. So we have our cerebrum, which is this large area right here, and in it we have these folds and these bumps that we're going to call gyri and sulci and fissures, and then down here you have the cerebellum. Okay, motor patterns, complex somatic motor patterns. All right, so if you have an issue with the cerebellum, you're going to have an issue with those complex somatic motor patterns. When we talk about the cerebrum, this is really what separates us from other organisms, where we have these complex thoughts, intellectual functions. Memory storage is a big one, emotions. So think about that when you ever look at any comparative anatomy. You're looking at other animals, you're going to see that the reason that they have smaller ones, or the reason that we have bigger ones, is because we have evolved to have more area for emotions and intelligent thought and complex thoughts, like intangible ideas. All right, people always talk about, oh yeah, that person is deep. All right, in order for you to be deep, animals aren't that deep. In order for you to be deep, you need to have this large cerebrum. Diencephalon is located under the cerebellum, and it links the cerebrum with the brainstem. And there's three divisions of the diencephalon. You have the left thalamus, the right thalamus, and then the hypothalamus. And the thalamus relays and processes sensory information, where the hypothalamus is a location for production of hormones, emotion as well, and then autonomic function. The diencephalon also has the pituitary gland, which is connected to the hypothalamus. So when you think about the nervous system and the endocrine system both having to do with coordinating things, you're going to see that the hypothalamus is really the connection between the two. Okay, the hormones are going to be there for more long-term things that are going to go on. We're going to release hormones in order to make sure that people grow and make sure that the menstrual cycle stays the way it should be. But the pituitary gland is a more, you could think of more of as, since it's a gland, it's more of like a endocrine organ, where the hypothalamus is more of like a brain, part of the brain, and or nervous system organ, and where they link up is really the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is kind of the connection between the endocrine system and the nervous system, because remember, everything's related, everything's connected, and it has this stalk called the infundibulum, and it is the interface for nervous and endocrine systems. And then the brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and very important, the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain, also called the mesencephalon, it processes sight, sound, and associated reflexes, maintains consciousness. Pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem and is involved in somatic and visceral motor control. The medulla oblongata is going to connect the brain to the spinal cord, relays information, and it regulates autonomic, all right, those things you're not thinking about, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, breathing. All of these things are done by, or watched over by, the medulla oblongata. So if your medulla oblongata is severed, all right, you can't say, this person had the lower part of their spinal cord severed, so they were paralyzed from the waist down. With the medulla oblongata, if you sever that, you're not just going to be paralyzed, you're going to die, because you can't keep your heart rate where it should be, your blood pressure where it should be, your breathing rate where it should be, and you're not going to be digesting properly. So without that control of your digestive functioning, your blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing, you're not going to live. So any issue with the medulla oblongata leads to major issues, leads to death. This is a diagram just showing you where you have that thalamus and then you have that hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Right? This entire piece, all of these is called the brainstem. So when you think about the brain, we think about the cerebrum. When we think about the brainstem, we're talking about the medulla oblongata along with the pons and the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. There's four ventricles to the brain. We talk about we don't really talk about the first two, but the major ones that we do talk about are the third and the fourth ventricle. And you have these interventricular foramen, or foramen of Monro, and it's going to help with communication between the lateral ventricles. All right, you have lateral ones, that's the first and the second. All right, those are our lateral ventricles, and they're going to connect with our third ventricle. And then you have the fourth ventricle, which extends into that medulla oblongata and becomes continuous with the central canal. If you remember some of the anatomy from the previous chapter, the central canal, that center dot or hole or tunnel down that spinal cord, and it connects with the third ventricle via a narrow canal in the midbrain called the aqueduct, the cerebral aqueduct. So this shows you these ventricles where we have these two, first and second, are these lateral ventricles, and then you're going to have this third ventricle right here and this fourth ventricle right here, which are all very important with talking about cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. Another diagram to show you. So the brain is a large, delicate mass of neural tissue. So we've been talking about neural tissue. Well, all of this stuff, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves, the brain, all this stuff is made up of neural tissue, the neurons that are going to be responsible for relaying those messages. And it's containing internal passages and chambers filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And each of the 6 major brain regions has specific functions, like we've talked about with the ascending and the descending portions of these. Conscious thought and intelligence are produced in the neural cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. So when we talk about the cerebral hemisphere and we're talking about that neural cortex, that is where we get conscious thought, those deep thoughts, and intelligence from. Physical protection of the brain, that's where we talk about cerebrospinal fluid. Any isolation or separation from any biochemicals or anything that we don't necessarily want in there. All right, we have this blood-brain barrier that's allowing certain things in, and other things it's keeping from getting in there, so that we don't poison the brain. We have coverings to the brain. You have that, just like in the spinal cord, we had the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. We have the same, but they are instead of them being the spinal meninges, they are now the cranial meninges, and we have that outside dura mater, that in between arachnoid mater, and then the inside pia mater. All right. They do connect with the spinal meninges, but like we always do in anatomy, we like to separate the things out and call them different things. So it protects the brain from any cranial trauma. It's trying to make sure that every time you don't have a little hit your head a little bit, it's not going to cause major issues to your brain. So if you smack your head really hard, yeah, you're going to get a concussion, but this is there to kind of support and cushion your brain. So here we see the different layers. Okay, you have that arachnoid mater, you have that dura mater on the outside, and then within you have the pia mater. So cerebrospinal fluid surrounds all exposed surfaces of the central nervous system, interchanges with interstitial fluid of the brain, and the functions include it cushions, it supports the brain, and then it also is going to transport nutrients as well as chemical messengers. You have a choroid plexus, which is going to be responsible for secreting cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles, and it removes any waste products from the cerebrospinal fluid. It produces about 500 milliliters per day. So we need this choroid plexus in order to have our cerebrospinal fluid. Circulates from the choroid plexus, that's where it's starting, through the ventricles to the central canal of the spinal cord, and that choroid plexus is responsible for making sure that there is cerebrospinal fluid throughout those areas. This is a diagram showing you up here you have that choroid plexus, and it is making sure that cerebrospinal fluid is being secreted and is going throughout this area of the central nervous system. Blood supplied to the brain, you have nutrients and oxygen that you want to get to the brain. It's going to be delivered by the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries, which we'll talk more about when we talk about circulation, and removed from the dural sinuses by the interjugular veins. So we're going to send blood up through the carotid arteries, and we're going to remove it through the jugular veins. Cerebrovascular disease, you have disorders where they interfere with blood circulation to the brain, which we talk about aneurysms, where there's a loss of oxygen to the brain. You have these aneurysms that are these outpouchings of the veins in the brain, and you're gonna ultimately see that when you cut off oxygen to the brain for extended period, you're going to end up having a stroke or a CVA, cerebrovascular accident. It shuts off the blood to the portion of the brain, and neurons start to die. And once those neurons start to die, you're going to see problems with functioning, and that's why people that have a stroke often end up being, paralyzed on one side, depending on where that stroke took place within the brain. So blood-brain barrier, sometimes called BBB, it isolates the central nervous system neural tissue from general circulation, and it's there really to protect us. For breaks in the blood-brain barrier, you have portions of the hypothalamus. It secretes hypothalamic hormones. You have a posterior lobe. So when we talk about the pituitary gland, you have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. There's a break in the posterior lobe, and it secretes ADH and oxytocin. You have the pineal gland, which is going to secrete the pineal secretions, and then you have the choroid plexus, where specific epidermal cells maintain blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. So protection and support, remember you have those meninges, you have the cerebrospinal fluid, and you have the blood-brain barrier in order to make sure that our brain is maintaining homeostasis. The medulla oblongata is going to allow the brain and the spinal cord to communicate. Very important. Remember, we talked about the medulla oblongata is there for the breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. So all very important things that we need to maintain life. So any organism that you talk about, they're going to have that medulla oblongata, and they, it's not just a human thing. They're going to have it. Even if they have a small cerebrum, they're going to have that medulla oblongata because it is responsible for maintaining that homeostasis. When we move on to talk about cranial nerves, you're going to see that we have 12 cranial nerves, and they come off of the brain as well as this brain stem. All right, so these are all nerves coming off, and they are going to help innervate numerous things throughout the body. So this just shows you where they come off. Obviously, they extend past where they kind of show you that they cut off, but they keep going. And you have three groups of nuclei within the medulla oblongata. You have an autonomic nuclei, sensory and motor of the cranial nerves, and then you have relay stations along sensory and motor pathways. The autonomic nuclei of the medulla oblongata, you have reticular formation, you have reflex centers, which include the cardiovascular centers and the respiratory rhythmicity centers. And then you have sensory and motor nuclei of the medulla oblongata, which includes 5 of 12 cranial nerves, that is 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Relay stations of the medulla oblongata. Functions of the cerebellum: adjusts postural muscles, making sure you stand upright, fine-tunes conscious and subconscious movements. The Diencephalon is going to integrate sensory information and motor commands. You have that thalamus, that epithalamus, and the hypothalamus, along with the pineal gland found in the posterior epithalamus. And it secretes hormone melatonin, helps with sleep. It's a big one. So when you hear about people talking about they're not getting enough sleep, they're trying to eat blueberries. Right? Blueberries have a lot of melatonin, which are going to help them sleep. So melatonin plays a major part in dreaming as well as sleeping. So the thalamus filters ascending sensory information for primary sensory cortex and relays the information between the basal nuclei and the cerebral cortex. Some functions of the hypothalamus is going to provide subconscious control of the skeletal muscle, making sure that you stand upright. You don't really tend to think about standing upright. You just kind of do it. Controls autonomic function, coordinates the activities of the nervous and endocrine system, secretes hormones. The big hormones that we talk about in the next chapter are antidiuretic hormone as well as oxytocin. Oxytocin plays a major part in uh, being in labor. We talked about positive feedback mechanisms earlier in the year, and a major part of that was that release of oxytocin to make sure that not only is pain decreased while the mother is giving birth, but also to start the production of milk for the baby. It produces emotions and behavior drives, as where we typically talk about hunger and thirst. So hunger and thirst are a responsibility of hypothalamus, and it coordinates voluntary and autonomic functions, regulates body temperature, and controls circadian rhythms. All right, that's sleeping, like I talked about with the pineal gland plays a major role. Hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, hunger, thirst, and sleep. Very important. Limbic system is a functional group that establishes emotional states, links conscious function with autonomic function of the brainstem, and facilitates memory storage and retrieval. So it's not memory storage itself, but it facilitates the memory storage. And this just gives you a diagram of the limbic system. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, controls all conscious thoughts and intellectual functions. You have gray matter and you have white matter within that cerebrum. And we talk about insula, gyri. You have a longitudinal fissure which separates the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And then you also have lobes. So the lobes, you're in luck because they're named after the bones. So if we know the bones of the skull, then we're going to know the lobes of the skull. So you have a central sulcus, which divides the anterior or the frontal lobe from the posterior or the parietal lobe. Remember, we talked about the frontal bone. Well, if you remember where the frontal bone is behind that, you're going to see the frontal lobe of the brain, just like the parietal lobe. If you remember where that is, you're going to see that the parietal lobe of the brain. You have a lateral sulcus, which divides the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Remember, that's on the side, temporal lobes towards the ears. And then you have a parieto-occipital sulcus, which divides the parietal lobe from that occipital lobe in the back. All right, so you have that central sulcus, you have the lateral sulcus, and then you're going to have the parieto-occipital sulcus. Here we go, nice little diagram. You have a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus, and they sit along the central sulcus. Then you have this lateral sulcus, and even have the cerebrum here, where above it is going to be the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe. So if you remember the bones of the skull, now you're going to know the lobes of the brain. Another diagram showing you one half of the hemisphere, or one hemisphere of the brain. Three functional principles of the cerebrum. Each hemisphere receives sensory information from and sends motor commands to the opposite side of the body. So depending on where that stroke takes place, you're going to see the opposite side of the body paralyzed or having issues. The two hemispheres have different functions, although their structures are alike. Typically, you hear about people saying, "Oh, are you left brain, right brain, left hemisphere? Which one are you? Are you more artistic? Or are you more concrete?" All right, they've come to find out that it's not as simple as that. Both sides are able to do both. One side might be better than the other, but it's not as concrete as they once thought. So as we move forward and they do more research, they're seeing that it's a little more complicated than how we had hoped it would be, because it would make a lot more sense if everything was just concrete and this was this way and this was this way. But there's a big gray area where we see that it really depends on the person. So another function is the correspondence between a specific function and a specific region of the cerebral cortex is not precise. We have the precentral gyrus, right, that directs voluntary movements, and you're going to have the primary motor cortex is the surface of the precentral gyrus, and you have pyramidal cells are neurons of the primary motor cortex. So that precentral gyrus we're talking about motor cortex. And then you're going to have the postcentral gyrus, which is going to be sensory. So you have towards the anterior, you're going to have that motor, and towards the posterior, you're going to have that sensory. All right. Then some other cortexes. No, visual cortex. Okay, visual meaning sight. You have an auditory cortex for sound. Olfactory is going to be smelling or odor, and then you have the gustatory, which is going to be taste receptors. Within looking at this cerebrum, you are going to see that, well, visual cortex is occipital. All right, so even though your eyes are up here, you're going to see that all the way back here is the occipital lobe with the visual cortex back here. Okay, you have your auditory cortex right here, temporal lobe. Kind of makes more sense by the ear. Olfactory is within, and then your gustatory cortex for taste is right here. Associated areas, you have the sensory associated areas that monitor and interpret arriving information at sensory areas of cortex, and somatic sensory association area interprets input to primary sensory cortex. And you have the visual association areas, auditory association areas, and the somatic motor association area, integrative centers, general interpretive areas where we talk about Wernicke's area, present in only one hemisphere. It receives information from all sensory association areas, and it coordinates access to the complex visual and auditory memories. You have speech centers, prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe integrates information from sensory association, and it performs abstract intellectual activities. All right, abstract intellectual activities, that's all part of the prefrontal cortex. So keep that in mind. As we move forward, think about all of these things that are within the brain. This just gives you an idea of where these things are. And we're moving from the nervous system to the endocrine system next. So think about all of these things that are helping with the communication in the body to make sure that we maintain homeostasis.